Okay, hello everyone. In the interest of time, I think we should get started. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I am Eric Lufer. I'm the president of the Citizens Research Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on the data-driven assessment of Michigan's road program. This is a report we published a few weeks ago, got a lot of media attention, and we want to bring it to you in a visual webinar presentation to help you understand what was said and give you a chance to ask any questions. The Citizens Research Council is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is our 109th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private not-for-profit organization, and we rely on charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, governments, and individuals. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan, such as our road program. If you value this webinar and the associated paper, please contribute to the public discourse and want to keep the Citizens Research Council as an objective, independent, credible source of information into the next century. Please consider a contribution. We will put a PDF file of this presentation on the website shortly after we conclude today. And additionally, we are recording this session. It'll be available. It takes a little bit of time for the software to process everything, but that will be put up this afternoon as soon as is reasonably possible. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 734-788-1732. And after the webinar, you'll receive email asking for any feedback, and we very much appreciate any thoughts that you have. This paper and the accompanying webinar, marks a continuation of a long history of analyzing issues related to Michigan's road program. As far back as the 1920s, we were discussing issues related to the generation of revenues and the distribution of funding among Michigan's counties and municipal governments. Presenting today will be Eric Paul Dennis. Eric joined the Research Council in 2022 as an expert in civil infrastructure policy. Previous to his position with the Research Council, he spent 10 years as a transportation systems analyst focused on policy implications of emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, and intelligent transportation system. He's been a Michigan licensed professional engineer since 2012, and as a practicing engineer, he has design and project experience across multiple domains, including highways, airfields, telecommunications, and watershed management. He has his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Michigan State in 2006 and holds a master's degrees in environmental engineering and urban regional planning, both from the University of Michigan. With that, let me turn it over to Eric, and we look forward to any questions you have. Again, you may place them in the software place for questions, and we'll ask questions at the end of this session. Thank you. Eric.
Thanks, Eric. So thank you everyone for being here. Again, we are providing an overview of our recent report, and here's kind of an overview of what's in that report. We look at road funding levels in Michigan from 2004 to 2024, and then in a separate analysis, compare Michigan's funding to other states. We then look at road system condition, both historically in Michigan and compared to other states. We then put these analyses together to evaluate Michigan's road program performance, by which I mean the ability to use available funding to best achieve desirable system condition. Finally, we conclude with a discussion regarding what all of this data and analysis implies for road funding policy in Michigan. Oops. So let's start with funding. This is our state transportation budget. If you've ever looked into road funding before, you've almost definitely seen this chart. This is straight from the House Fiscal Agency. This is good data, and I wanted to acknowledge it exists, but we didn't use this directly because these numbers include things like public transit and airport funding. We wanted to really focus on funding of roads and bridges. So we made this chart. We were able to draw from a couple of House Fiscal Agency studies that pulled out funding specifically for our roads program. This shows the same general trend as our budget, but it's a little different as this reflects funding of pavement and bridge programs specifically. This analysis, which took some time, this allowed us to make this next chart, which is really cool. So this takes that nominal funding from our last slide and converts it to inflation-adjusted funding in 2023 dollars. This gives us a really good idea of purchasing power of our road funding over time. And I'm quite sure this has never been done before, at least not this accurately. I've seen this done by taking our transportation budget and adjusting it by typical inflation measures like the Consumer Price Index. But this won't give you a great answer. First, because again, our transportation program includes things other than roads and bridges, but moreover, construction cost inflation that our road agencies are subject to doesn't track with typical inflation metrics like the CPI and almost always runs hotter. I've seen at least one approach that realized this and adjusted our transportation budget to the National Highway Construction Cost Index published by the Federal Highway Administration. This is a slightly more clever approach, but will also not get you a great answer because that figure is a national average of construction cost inflation, which can vary surprisingly widely between states. Fortunately, Michigan is one of a handful of states that actually calculates a state-specific highway construction cost index based on MDOT bid letting. So we used this data in combination with the regional CPIU to derive a best estimate of road program real purchasing power in 2023 dollars. So the gray line at the bottom is nominal funding. This is the same data as the previous slide. We also show how this diverges in 2020 to show road funding both with and without the Rebuilding Michigan Bond Program. The blue line is our inflation adjusted funding. So in 2004, we spent a nominal $2.6 billion on roads and bridges. This was worth about $5 billion in 2023 equivalent dollars. Then inflation ate away at our basically flat nominal funding until hitting a low of $3.8 billion in 2016. After 2016, we started receiving new revenue from the 2015 road funding package, bringing us up to $5.3 billion in 2024, or $5.9 billion if you include the bond funding. Now, in future years, we're going to lose this bond funding. It's also likely we'll see somewhat of a decline in federal funding. You may have heard this described as a pending fiscal cliff, which would imply something of an emergency to address road funding. And it is true, if we don't send more revenue to our road program, we are likely to see a drop in purchasing power in future years. But that should be put in context by recognizing that as of 2024, we were better funded than at any time in the past 20 years. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about funding at this time. As you can see, even if our nominal funding stays flat, inflation can eat away at purchasing power fairly quickly. But as we have these talks, let's keep all this in context. We don't seem to be in a panic situation quite yet. So that's the crux of our Michigan-specific historical funding analysis. But what about compared to other states? If you want to fairly compare Michigan's road levels to other states, this is a much more complicated question than you might initially expect. I'm not going to go into detail about our methodology, but I want to point out that there is a lot of financial data available and there are a lot of options for how to evaluate that data. If you're not careful, you can get a result that misrepresents what's really going on. For example, I've seen an analysis showing that Michigan ranks dead last in the nation for road funding. And this was done by taking a subset of financial data from the Census Bureau, specifically capital outlays, and dividing it by state population. We use some of the same data and our research supports this. If you take capital outlays reported by the census and then normalize that to state population, Michigan ranks 50th over the decade analyzed. We also included a cost correction step. This accounts for different construction costs between states. After this step, Michigan ranked 46th, which is still pretty low. But there are many more potential ranking methods, all of which are similarly valid. So you can kind of choose your own adventure here. If you want to argue that Michigan is near the bottom of states in road funding, there's data that could show that. If you want to argue that Michigan is relatively well funded, there's data that would show that. And neither method would necessarily be any more or less correct, but just reflect different methods of evaluation. We wanted to be as comprehensive and objective as possible, but still provide a simple result with a single ranking, so we combined multiple data sources normalized in different ways. So here are the results of our state road funding analysis. We found Michigan to be the 30th most well-funded state overall, using data from 2012 to 2021, which was 2021 was the most recently available data at the time of analysis. So let's look at Michigan's data and walk through what this table is showing. The very first column shows that Michigan received an index score of 19.6 in the category of funding per centerline mile of the public road system. So what does that mean? We combined data tables reflecting various aspects of the funding process, such as revenue, distributions, and capital expenditures. And we did that to avoid potential biases in a single data source from overwhelming the analysis. But since we combine different aspects of the funding process, dollar figures are no longer meaningful. We had to abstract away from that with an index score based on the range of dollar figures in that category. It's actually a little bit simpler than it sounds. So Michigan's index score of 19.6 in funding per centerline mile renders a national ranking of 27th. The second category was funding per lane mile with an adjustment factor for bridge costs. There we rank 26th. The third category is by funding per capita. This is our lowest component score, ranking at 39th. High population states, actually I should say more urbanized, densely populated states, which Michigan is, generally rank lower by this method of analysis. That's a feature of the approach, not necessarily a problem. The fourth category is funding per truck vehicle miles traveled. This is a somewhat unusual way to compare funding, but I think is really important because trucks impose the strong majority of pavement damage and thus related maintenance and construction costs. As a peninsula, Michigan gets relatively little truck traffic, and so in this category, we rank 18th. If you're wondering, this does not factor truck weights. Michigan has some uniquely heavy trucks because of our unique truckload regulations. I would have liked to account for that, but that data just isn't available. So the final index score is a simple average of these four component index scores and gives us a ranking of Michigan as the 30th most well-funded state overall. But you can see there's a lot of complexity behind that. If you want to focus on different ways of evaluating this, you can look into the details of this methodology and draw your own conclusions. So I know that was a ton to digest in just a few minutes, but we have a lot more to get through, so let's look at system conditions. I'm going to start with bridges because this is fairly simple to explain. A spoiler alert when I start talking about pavement is that our pavement data is not simple, but with bridges, we have a coherent, comprehensive data set because the Federal Highway Administration requires a comprehensive standardized method of inspection and reporting on all public road bridges, and then publishes that data through the National Bridge Inventory. This data is available both by bridge count and deck area, both of which could be important depending on what you want to look at. So we're showing both here in this time series chart. The solid lines represent condition of bridges by count. The dashed line represent condition of bridges by deck area. Since 2004, we've reduced the percentage of our bridge infrastructure in poor condition by about half. And this is really good progress. That said, you can see in the table on the right, we're still not doing so great compared to other states. As of 2024, with 11.3% of our bridges in poor condition, this ranks 43rd nationally and below all peer states except for Pennsylvania. As far as pavement, usually in Michigan, when we talk about pavement condition, we're using data provided by the Transportation Asset Management Council, or TAMC. If you pay attention to Michigan road policy, you've probably seen these charts before. We use this data, but we present it a little bit differently. So I just want to point out that the data that I'm going to show on the next slide is the exact same data, just in a different format. So here's TAMC's pavement condition data going back to 2004, which is when they started collecting this data on our federal aid eligible network. Our FAE network is about 1/3 of our roads, but includes our most economically important high traffic roads. These are the roads that are eligible for federal aid. And there are many different ways of assessing pavement condition. TAMC chose a modified version of a metric called PACER. This might seem a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's relevant, so stick with me for a second. PACER was introduced by the University of Madison, Wisconsin in 1987. It provides a method of rating a road on a 1 through 10 scale by windshield survey, which is another way of stating that road agency staff drives the road and records a number 1 through 10. The issue that PACER was meant to address was that in Wisconsin, like in Michigan, there are many rural and small city road agencies. Historically, many of these small road agencies manage pavement somewhat informally. Often they would use a 1 through 10 rating scale, but without reference to any standard, so there wasn't much consistency. So PACER provided a slightly more formalized technique for agencies that lack the resources for a comprehensive pavement management system. And I think this can work well in that context. If you're a small agency managing a small city network or low traffic rural roads, PACER can be a very useful tool. TAMC has adopted a modified version of PACER, which I'm calling MyPACER, which we now use to assess our entire federal aid road network. This decision appears to have been made because they wanted to adopt a system that could be used by all of Michigan's local road agencies, many of which are small and or rural. MyPACER data is inexpensive and simple to collect. In fact, the current TAMC data collection manual has a photo on the cover of the data collection process, which is 2 or 3 staff driving the road and recording a number 1 through 10. So one issue is that this is a rather subjective metric. There are a number of human biases that could impact this rating. TAMC's data is often presented as though it is an objective and engineering quality metric, but it is neither. So we should be very cautious in how we interpret and use this data. One way that this data is used is to forecast pavement conditions into the future. So this chart on the left is our historical MyPACER data. On the right, I'm showing just the percentage of pavement rated in poor condition along with several forecasts that TAMC has performed. And you can see the forecasts have not been accurate. Every single forecast predicted pavement deteriorating faster than what was subsequently observed. Here's what I think might have happened. As you can see on the left, in the initial years of MyPACER data measurement, TAMC reported an extremely rapid deterioration in pavement conditions. From an engineering perspective, I don't think it makes much sense that an entire system would deteriorate so rapidly. But remember, MyPACER is a somewhat subjective metric, so there are all sorts of human factors that might help explain this trend that have nothing to do with actual pavement condition. but it seemed TAMC accepted this as ground truth and now uses the initial years of data trends to create their forecasts. These forecasts are then used to estimate statewide funding needs. For example, one analysis based on this data concluded that Michigan has an annual funding gap of $3.9 billion. For context, our 2024 road program included about $3.6 billion in state revenue. Such funding gap estimates should be critically reviewed. They're based on this subjective metric that is of questionable reliability and forecasting quality. So that's a problem at the state level. This is, I think, kind of confusing our policy discussions about the conditions of our system and subsequent funding needs. There are more problems on a local level to the extent that relatively large road agencies are now relying on MyPacer for a pavement management system. If you're managing a complex network of high traffic routes, MyPacer cannot tell you what you really need to know for planning investments. It's not an engineering quality metric. It can't tell you anything about why a pavement may be in the condition that it's rated in, how rapidly it may deteriorate in the future, or what an appropriate management strategy may look like. So if you're a large road agency relying on MyPacer for pavement management, you're likely to struggle to make efficient investments in your system. Fortunately, there are other ways to assess pavement condition. Probably the most common metric is called the International Roughness Index, or IRI. The Federal Highway Administration requires all states to submit this for federal reporting, and this is a fairly reliable, standardized, and objective metric. Unfortunately, this is only required on the National Highway System, which is a subset of the federal aid network and includes only about 6% of our public road system by mile. But this does include interstates, primary arterials, and most of our most economically critical high traffic routes. So this is showing our National Highway System IRI data, which looks very different than MyPacer. Now, these metrics compare different things at different system scopes. So even if our MyPacer data was very reliable, we would still expect differences, but this is very different. Recall that our MyPacer data showed a rapid decline in conditions from 2004 to 2010. The IRI data shows an increase in pavement in good condition over this period. It's not impossible that the subset of the federal aid network making up the National Highway System improved while the entire federal aid network declined, but I think it's unlikely, and again calls into question the reliability of MyPacer data on which we base our statewide pavement management system and funding needs estimates. There are a lot of different ways you could break this data apart for further analysis. So here on the left, I've got our MyPacer data for the portion of the federal aid network owned by MDOT. This is essentially our state trunk line system. Below that, I've got the rest of the federal aid network that is locally owned. On the right, I've got IRI data for our urban national highway system on the top and our rural national highway system routes on the bottom. There's a lot of things we can talk about here, but what I mostly want to point out is that in most ways that you look at our pavement data, there is a consistent trend that shows a decline in pavement over fair condition over nearly 2 decades. Now, a declining percentage of pavement in fair condition isn't necessarily a bad thing. For example, this chart in the lower right shows IRI on the rural national highway system. On these routes, pavement in poor condition is already near negligible at about 2 or 3%. So declining pavement in fair condition means we're gaining pavement in good condition. That could be a good thing, probably a good thing. But when you see this as a general system trend across nearly 2 decades, I think the most reasonable interpretation is that Michigan has experienced reduced ability to cost effectively maintain pavement in fair condition over the last 2 decades. And I think this is related to the metrics and decision processes that we've chosen for pavement management systems. So that's an overview of our pavement system condition time series analysis for Michigan data. So now let's look at how we rank against other states. Similar to our road funding index, we created a novel road system condition index. This is actually one table, just split into two to make it fit on a slide. So these are the top 25 states on the left, the bottom 25 states on the right. There's Michigan at number 40. As with the road funding comparison, there's a lot of data out there and you could cherry pick if you want. We wanted a ranking that was as comprehensive and objective as possible. So we used 17 different metrics available from federal data combined into a weighted average index score and related ranking. And we've concluded that Michigan ranks 40th in system condition. There's a lot of work behind that. I think it's fairly well justified, but I don't want to dwell here. I want to move on to performance requirements, performance assessments. And again, by performance, we mean the ability to utilize given funding at whatever level to effectively manage and maintain the road system. So we put months of analysis into creating a road funding index that uses data from 2012 to 2021, and a road condition index that uses the most recent available data ranging from 2020 to 2022. So this gives us an opportunity to plot these together to better understand how road condition is related to the preceding decade of funding levels on a state-by-state basis. The hypothesis was that generally better funded states would have better system conditions. Surprisingly, the data doesn't show that. This analysis suggests that there is essentially zero correlation between funding and condition. And this is not intuitive, but I've looked at this in several different ways and this conclusion holds up. So there's not really any correlation, but there is a notable tendency. There are 25 states in this box. So half of all states have achieved relatively good system condition with relatively low funding. Now, keep in mind, this is all relative. This isn't saying that roads in Georgia or Indiana are outstanding, just relatively better than most states according to the available data. So recall that Michigan ranked 40th in system condition. So there are 39 other states that have, by the available data, achieved better system condition than Michigan. And more than half of these states have achieved those conditions with similar or lesser funding levels than Michigan, including peer states like Ohio and Indiana. There's also states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that have better system conditions than Michigan, but they're spending a lot more to get there. There's a lot of caveats to this analysis. There are some variables that are really hard to control for. There's also the issue that the service life of infrastructure is a lot longer than 10 years. I preferably would have liked to evaluate a longer time period of funding data. The issue is, well, the first issue is that this is incredibly time consuming and there are resource constraints, but more importantly, the farther back in time you go, the analysis of funding data becomes either exponentially more complicated or exponentially less reliable. Meanwhile, the relevance of that funding data to current conditions gradually decays to zero. So understand that there is some uncertainty here, but I wouldn't be presenting this if I weren't confident that this is telling us something important. Specifically, it appears possible for Michigan to move up into this box without huge influxes of new funding. Furthermore, I've looked at this in multiple ways, and available data seems to show pretty consistently that the correlation between overall funding and system conditions on a state-by-state basis is weak at best. Admittedly, this was unexpected, but it seems to check out. So our next thought was, even if there's no relationship between condition and funding across states, surely within a single state, more funding would make a system better off. This brings us back to our time series funding and condition analyses for Michigan alone. We made a bunch of charts that look kind of like this, plotting relative changes in funding and system conditions over time, going back to 2004. This one shows our MyPacer data on the federal aid network. And I think the main thing this shows us is that the increase in pavement in poor condition since 2004 was so extreme that we should just keep in mind that PACER is a subjective metric of questionable reliability. Here we focus on our IRI pavement condition data on the national highway system. This data covers a more limited percentage of the network, but it's a much more reliable metric and at least shows changes relative to funding at the same scale. But the trends aren't very intuitive. From 2004, as our funding levels were dropping, we initially saw an increase in pavement in good condition and a decrease in pavement in poor condition. That reversed around 2010. Part of that looks to be related to an expansion of the NHS system that happened in 2012, but even accounting for that, there was a reversal in condition trends with a fairly consistent trend in road funding. Then as our funding increased, things were relatively flat until just recently when we see some rapid improvements. But these last 2 years of data must be caveated because there was a lot of unreported data. Generally, it's hard to discern a clear trend here. Remember, what we're trying to do is understand the relationship between funding and system conditions. This method of analysis at least suggests a fairly loose relationship. So another thought was that maybe this assessment would make more sense if we included pavements and bridges together. After all, the road program funding goes to both of them. And perhaps there were some shifting investment strategies that could explain this. So this chart shows percentage good and percentage poor conditions for both pavements and bridges on the national highway system relative to changes in funding. I think the most obvious takeaway here is that we've done a pretty good job in addressing bridges in poor conditions since 2004. Otherwise, there still aren't any intuitive trends here, but I wanted to do anything I could to quantify the relationship between funding and system conditions. So I took advantage of a feature of our funding levels since 2004. We generally had a period of declining funding from 2004 to 2016 and a period of increasing funding after 2016. This allows for sort of a natural experiment. So these two tables summarize how changing system conditions have related to changing funding levels over these two periods. I know this is confusing as hell. Let me try to explain what I did. So this table on the left looks at our period of decreasing funding. In inflation-adjusted funding, in 2004, we spent $5 billion. This declined to $3.8 billion in 2016. So this was an absolute change of $1.2 billion and a relative change of negative 23%. We then compare that change in funding to changes in system conditions in the following year, 2017. So the numbers in red are the direction that you'd expect to see following a period of declining funding. For example, for national highway system pavement in poor condition measured by IRI, you would probably expect to see an increase, and we do see that. After this period of a 23% funding decrease, NHS pavement in poor condition increased from 12.3 to 14.3%. This is a 2% absolute change and a 16% relative change. Related, you would expect pavement in good condition to decrease as funding declines, but that didn't happen. Pavement in good condition increased by 24% over this period as a relative measure. So that's weird. Ideally, there would be enough of a relationship here that you could conclude something like what percentage of funding increase would be necessary to get our system into acceptable condition, however you'd like to define that. I think we can conclude that funding increases since 2016 have improved our systems somewhat, but there's a ton of noise in the data. I have no idea how to turn any available data into a statewide funding needs estimate that's justified and reliable, and I would question anyone's ability to do so. condition and funding just haven't been related in a consistent way. I also want to point out that during both periods, we've lost pavement in fair condition. Again, a drop in pavement in fair condition isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you see this over near 20 years, regardless of if funding increases or decreases, I interpret this as a pavement management approach that is not facilitating cost-effective maintenance projects. We are increasingly letting pavements fall into poor condition and then reconstructing them. Notably, this is not the case with bridges. There appears to be a different, likely more efficient strategy there. So what does all this imply for policy? The main takeaway is that overall road funding levels are only one factor in achieving good system condition. The results of this study are kind of frustrating because neither the state-by-state analysis nor the Michigan time series analysis of performance shows a clear relationship between funding and condition. Finding such a relationship was certainly a goal of this research. However, the lack of such a finding was not a failure of the research. Instead, we've successfully shown that these are complex systems, and there's a lot going on with regards to how funding is spent. You can be quite well funded and have a very inefficient road program. On the other hand, it seems that a well-designed road program can help make sure that your plans and investment decisions are efficient and effective in making the most with whatever funding is available. So in evaluating performance compared to other states, Michigan isn't nearly the worst, but we certainly have room to improve. There are a lot of places to look for inefficiencies in Michigan's road program, but I think we should start with the governing law, Public Act 51 of 1951. I want to provide a little bit of history in how this law was written. This may seem in the weeds, but I think this is important context and might be a even better argument than all the data we just looked at. So in 1948, there was a state commission study called Bases and Procedures for Determining Highway, Road, and Street Deficiencies in Michigan. Act 51 was written to address these deficiencies. Now, you might assume that the word deficiency in this context means poor pavement or crumbling bridges. It did not. It meant lack of roads and need for more high-speed arterials and highways. This report was heavily influenced by industry lobbyists. The study committee was chaired by a representative from the Michigan trucking industry, also included the Automobile Club of Michigan and the Michigan road building industry. More relevant is that the consultant who probably wrote most of this study was the Automotive Safety Foundation. This was a very powerful lobbying group at the time, backed by the automotive and petroleum industries. The ostensible goal of the Automotive Safety Foundation was to improve road safety, hence the name. However, there's a historian at the University of Virginia named Peter Norton, who, among others, has documented their true long-term goal, which was to reconstruct America from a nation of cities, towns, and country into a nation of suburbs, where travel by automobile would not only be easier, but practically necessary to fully participate in society and the economy. Their lobbying efforts were remarkably successful and really formed the basis of modern transportation policy in America to this day. Their primary goal was to sell more cars and oil. The Automotive Safety Foundation also effectively wrote Act 51, as well as road funding laws in several other states, as well as much of the Federal Highway Act. Furthermore, as documented in this 1952 Highway Conference proceedings, Michigan's legislature intended Act 51 as a 15-year construction program specifically to enact the changes proposed by this 1948 study. It was initially scheduled to sunset, which would then allow the state to transition from a highway construction phase to a maintenance phase. That didn't happen for several reasons, including the passage of the Federal Highways Act in 1956, which provided more road funding and influenced transportation policy and long-term goals in a variety of ways. So after multiple extensions, the sunset provision of Act 51 was eventually just removed by legislative amendment. So here we are, nearly 75 years later, using a law written for a very different time and very different priorities. There have been over 300 amendments to Act 51, but it still retains much of the original formula. First, state funding is distributed according to ownership. Originally, 44% of funding went to MDOT. That's been adjusted down to 39.1%. But keep in mind, the original formula preceded the Federal Highways Act, which now gives MDOT substantial federal funding. Originally, 37% went to counties. That's been adjusted up to 39.1%. Originally, 19% went to cities and villages. That's been adjusted up to 21.8%. There's also 43 more cities and villages included in the formula now than there were in 1951. So there's been some minor adjustments there at the top level formula, but still pretty close to the original splits. It's also more complicated than that because there's been all sorts of special programs and carve-outs that have been since added by amendment. But the basic formula uses the same factors that were used in 1951. This is not adapted to changing priorities over the last 74 years, nor incorporated improved understanding of road management. So on the right, we list factors that are directly related to road funding needs. First is system size by road type and usage classification. The Federal Highway Administration has a pretty coherent method of classifying road uses and establishing performance requirements based on those uses. Obviously, an interstate highway or a 5-lane arterial costs more than a low-volume local road. Now, Act 51 sort of does this, but retains a 1950s era understanding of road use. County roads are classified as either primary or local. City and village roads are classified as either major or local. But Act 51 doesn't establish how to classify these other than by stating that it should be done, quote, on the basis of greatest general importance to the jurisdiction. As a result, for example, we have county primary roads ranging from multi-lane arterials like the mile roads in Wayne County, but also frequently include low-volume, even gravel roads in more rural counties. And Act 51 considers these very similarly in terms of funding needs. Another cost factor, traffic volume. This is not included in the current formula. Especially concerning is that truck traffic is not included. Again, truck traffic is very closely correlated with pavement damage and related costs. Bridges are expensive, not included in the formula. There are carve-outs for this, but maybe we could do this better by actually including it in the formula. Also, Michigan is a big state with different climate impacts and different geologies, both of which are very relevant to cost imposed. Neither of these are considered in the current formula. So if your system is built on wet clay subgrade with frequent freeze-thaw cycles, you're under a lot more pressure than if you're managing a system built mostly on sand. Next, construction in complex areas where there might be all sorts of underground infrastructure in the right-of-way, like sewers and gas lines. That increased construction costs by quite a bit, as well as planning and engineering costs. That's not a consideration in this current formula, at least not explicitly. Finally, local construction costs can vary by more than you'd think around the state, and that's not considered at all. So in summary, Act 51 does a poor job of getting money to where it's needed. How bad is it? I don't know exactly. This would take a lot more research than I'm able to conduct by myself, but I have some idea. So here I'm showing funding by population per county in 2023. These numbers include distributions to cities and villages within each county, but I added them all together basically so I could show this on the map. At the high end, Keweenaw County received $1,070 per resident. On the low end, Washtenaw County got $154 per resident. And you can see that generally our most urban counties receive the lowest amount of funding by population. Now, this doesn't mean anything in itself. Population does not directly impose road costs, but traffic does, especially truck traffic. And these counties are where some of our heaviest truck traffic is. Additionally, consider that freeze-thaw cycles are more challenging in the southern part of the state. Another consideration is that the southeastern part of the state is built largely on wet clay, has complex urban right-of-ways, and tends to have higher construction costs. Really understanding how mismatched and how inequitable and mismatched with needs Act 51 is would require more analysis than I'm able to conduct working alone with publicly available data. But as a first pass here, there are some strong indications that we are underfunding our most economically important high traffic roads. Here's another data point. So Michigan has 86% of our rural national highway system pavement in good condition. This is better than any peer state and ranks 7th nationally. By comparison, only 47% of our urban national highway system is in good condition, ranking 35th nationally. So this is another hint that we're underfunding more high volume urban routes, but there's a caveat. 80% of our national highway system network is state trunk line controlled by MDOT. MDOT's funding is distributed by department policy, not legislation, at least as far as I know. That might be wrong, but at least as far as I'm aware, this could be addressed without a legislative fix and suggests a need to look into how MDOT prioritizes its investments. And again, none of this is definitive, but suggests that we could be much more efficient at matching investments with needs. I think the overall policy implication is that we spend way too much time thinking about bottom line funding and not enough time thinking about how funding is spent. Elements of Michigan's road program may be reformed to improve efficiency and facilitate improved performance regardless of overall funding. Starting with the biggest thing, I know this is asking a lot, but Act 51 is a problem. Replacing it would be a major political and policy initiative, would probably require a lot more study, but we can't keep throwing more money into this system and expecting different results. There are some other things we could do either as part of this process or separate from it. This isn't a full list, but some points of emphasis. First, we think that local government should be allowed more local option revenue solutions. Second, there should be some critical review of pavement management systems in Michigan. We've already talked about some issues with MyPacer, which is the basis of our statewide pavement management approach. But MDOT actually doesn't use MyPacer directly for decision support, but there's some evidence that MDOT's approach has room for improvement as well. Finally, we recommend strengthening the state role in infrastructure planning and coordination. There are a few other policy recommendations in the report. Admittedly, none of these would be simple or easy, but there appears to be substantial room for improvement in our state road program. So I'm going to close with a quote often attributed to Winston Churchill. We're all out of money. It's time to start thinking. That is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you for listening. We're going to try to get to some questions. If there's not time, you can email me here. And let me see if I can.
So Eric, let me pose those questions to you here.
Okay.
Our friend Megan Owens asked a couple of questions, both at the time of registration and through the portal, related to sort of the metrics being used to measure the effectiveness. Does your analysis of the system performance consider just pavement quality, or more broadly look at ultimate goals of the roads, like access to jobs and other destinations, or negative impacts like the number of people who are killed on the roads, the access and pollution? So sort of you
I get it.
The road pavement quality. How else could the rest of those other metrics be used?
That is an outstanding question. The simple answer is no, we didn't look at any of that. This was already quite a complicated analysis. We focused very specifically on pavement and bridge condition versus pavement and bridge funding. Those other elements, I agree, are extremely important, deserving of more critical evaluation, not included in this report.
We have a question about the size of the road system relative to our funding, and the crux of the question is, have we built beyond our pocketbook? Have we extended the system so far beyond our ability to maintain it with the resources we're gathering?
That's a little bit of a loaded question. I want to be careful. Technically, clearly, yes. If you assume that our current and historical funding levels are appropriate, you can also see that our current and historical funding levels have not done a great job of keeping our system in good condition. So you could think of a different historical timeline where maybe we didn't build out roads so much and built more densely around our urban areas, where this wouldn't be so much of a problem. One thing I will say is that Michigan is not nearly alone here. I've actually looked at how, I haven't done this very formally, but I've kind of looked at how Michigan has developed in terms of population distribution compared to other states. We're not at all unusual, but the United States of America transportation policy, I think, is kind of similar to our health policy. Compared to other developed nations, we tend to spend a lot more and get worse results. So I think this is an issue nationwide. It's an issue probably in Michigan, but we're not at all exceptional there.
We had a few questions come in as you were presenting. And of course, it loses a little bit of context when we hold the questions to the end, but see if this makes sense and if you can respond. What was the cause and when did the funding separate from the quality of the roads in Michigan? In other words, can we make an assessment of why road quality and the amount available don't have that correlation as you were looking for?
Yeah, so our analysis only went back to 2004, and the reason that was chosen as a baseline year was because that's when we started collecting my PACER data, which again isn't the most reliable data, but because of the way we've done this, it's the most comprehensive data in terms of system scope. And it looks like since 2004, we've been becoming slowly less efficient and effective in how we spend road funding. If you were to go back farther in time, I'm not sure what that would look like. That would be interesting. I have talked to one of my former pavement professors at MSU who claimed that Michigan lost its way in the early 90s, maybe then. But otherwise, I don't know. I can't say anything definitive about that.
I think your conclusion of the presentation got to this question, but let me ask and see what you think. And it refers to the matrix of road versus pavement condition and how the different states fall on that matrix. What would be needed to move the quality of roads in Michigan into that box, that upper left quadrant with the current funding levels?
That is an extremely complicated question, and it's hard to answer in a abbreviated answer. We do our best to address that in the report. The short answer is there's at least a dozen, probably more than a dozen factors that could be looked at to figure out how we could be more efficient. I think, again, one of our biggest problems is our road distribution formula provided by Act 51 of 1951. I think if we were able to better match funding needs with distribution, that would take care of some of it. But there's other things that aren't in that formula, like our pavement management systems, things like thinking about contracting and warranty policy around how we contract out road work. So it's a really difficult question to answer. We do our best to answer it, but I can't say anything very clear about that. What I think we show, assuming that the previous 10 years of road funding is relevant to conditions at the end of that period, which I think is justified, we show that Michigan has room to improve. And so you can go from there and start thinking about where those inefficiencies might be. And we do provide in the report some reasonably extensive discussions about that.
Another question that came in midstream that I think was clarified as you went on, but let's reinforce the point. Do other states have other rating systems different than PACER, and do those states have a better rated performance? I tried to make the best of that question as I posed it, but
yeah,
PACER versus IRI or any other rating system.
Yeah, I understand. There are 50 different states. All states are required to submit some standardized data to the Federal Highway Administration for the Highway Performance Monitoring System. And so that gives us a good basis of comparison between states as far as system condition. It's really difficult to evaluate what states are actually doing for decision support and pavement management and long-term planning on a state-by-state basis. You can get to some of this. States are now required to report transportation asset management plans maybe it's every 3 years to the federal government. But it's really hard. It's hard to dig underneath what they say they're doing to figure out what they're actually doing. There are other states that use PACER. No other states use it on the entire federal aid network like we do. Like I mentioned, I think PACER is an appropriate tool for small and rural road agencies that can't afford to have a comprehensive pavement management system, can't afford to get data on things like IRI or other condition data. But when you take this and you start measuring highways and heavily trafficked arterials, that metric falls apart. It's just not meant to do this. You can't drive down the road and give a 1 through 10 rating and understand what's going on with the pavement or how to manage it. But that is a great question and something that I've looked into in the past, haven't gotten far because it's really hard to figure out what's going on with available data, but I hope to get back to that again.
Another kind of loaded question, but it gets exactly to our point. Is it safe to say Michigan is sending some counties too much money and others that are opposed to heavier trucks and more traffic volume are not getting enough money?
I would never say too much money. What I would say is that we as engineers, engineering community, we have now really good methods of estimating how much roads and bridges cost over their life cycle. So we can convert that into an annualized life cycle cost assessment. So if we were to do that at a state level, which would probably cost several $1 million, but would probably save us several $100 million a year in efficiencies, we could really figure out how much at a statewide level our system should cost, as well as for every individual agency. So that's what I think should be part of an effort to replace Act 51. So I wouldn't say anyone's overfunded at this point, but there is certainly inequity.
And we've also made the point that we don't need to create winners and losers out of this. If we're talking about putting more money into the system, it's possible to create a hold harmless, so nobody is getting less money, but you're directing the new money to the best use possible, the most effective improvement of the road system.
Right.
Just a few more questions and we will wrap up. We are just about at our witching hour. Have you looked at the systems in other states to know if other states have gleaned onto a funding act such as our Act 51, or is our Act 51 the oldest of what states are using?
I don't know. I spent so much time just figuring out what's going on with Act 51 that I haven't really been able to get into detail of what's going on in other states. I do intend to do that at some point in the future, especially for near peer states like Ohio and Indiana. I can say that at least historically in the 1950s and 60s, there were several other states whose funding laws looked very similar because, again, they were provided by the Automotive Safety Foundation. California, for example, which is part of the reason that Los Angeles looks like it does now. I don't know if they've done a better job of repealing and replacing those laws, but that's a very good question, and I would be very interested to look into that.
I think you just answered this question relative to the one before, but are you able to roughly estimate how much time it would take and how much money it would cost to conduct a study to make formal recommendation on how to repeal and replace Act 51?
No, I'm not sure. But I mean, let's pick a number, $10 million. That should be, I mean, that would give a pavement engineering consultant some pretty good resources to figure out what's going on here. And by comparison, in the last few years, we've spent, I think, $6 or $8 million trying to think of new funding mechanisms like road usage charging and tolling. So I think that kind of investment into more research than we have resources to provide at CRC with only publicly available data, I think would pay back multiples over.
All right, so that was the last of our questions. Eric, thank you for taking the time to do this. Again, you can find the full report on our website, crcmich.org. We have recorded this webinar and we will put the slides up. You will find those in the events tab on the webinar, the event related to this webinar. And happy to answer any questions. You can find Eric's contact information as well as mine on the website. And we would love to hear from you and appreciate your feedback. Thank you for taking the time, and we'll be in touch.